Let's move on to policing a protest. Joe White.
So you said that you on average police over 500 protests per year.
Yeah.
How does the law on public order provide your officers with the powers it needs to keep Londoners safe?
I think the law on public order, I'm looking for the tab with all my facts and figures in, excuse me. I think the law on public order is well out of date, and I'm encouraged that the Home Secretary has asked Lord Ken MacDonald to review sort of protest and hate crime legislation to see what changes can be made. I think the reason that is the case is the core of the Public Order Act around protest was written in the Public Order Act in the 1980s, a very, very different context. There have been tweaks and amendments multiple times since. Obviously, between sort of halfway between then and now, the Human Rights Act came in. So every protest-based policing decision, an officer has to consider the specifics of protest legislation and the generic principles of the Human Rights Act legislation, and find a balance between the two. We've seen so many cases where the decision the officer made as a command decision within maybe a day planning an event or on the ground during the event is then poured over all the way to the High Court or the Court of Appeal over subsequent years, examining whether those balances were right. That is not a fair position to put police officers into. So I think it's due a overhaul, and I hope Lord MacDonald finds that. We operate without fear or favour under the law. There is a lot of debate about our policing a protest. A lot of it seems to be based on what people hope the law might be rather than what it actually is. And we routinely find ourselves making a judgment in the middle of a situation about protest and counter-protest, where we're putting conditions on both of them to restrict the impacts on communities and restrict the risk of violence. And we'll find ourselves, people on this side of the sort of political or geopolitical argument will say you're favouring them, and people on this side of the argument will say you're favouring them. And I'm disappointed, frankly, that too often parliamentarians join that and add to that heat of everyone trying to push policing to be more in favour of their side. That's not our job. It's our job to be neutral and independent. I think the vast majority of what we've done over the last few years, I think we've got right. Occasionally you look at cases and think actually we could have been a bit more assertive there or a bit too assertive, but most of the time we've got it absolutely right. But it has been a very challenging operating environment for us. And for my officers on the ground, it's extraordinarily difficult when you've got people trying to catch you out, putting phones in your faces, trying to wind up officers. We had an officer have a pro-Palestine sticker stuck on his arm, get photographed, and then get death threats for supporting Palestine in the papers. We've had horrific things happen as people have been trying to use policing as a football, and that's been very difficult. But we will keep operating under the law as it is today without fear or favour.
So we recently met with the Greater Manchester Police, and they talked about the new phenomena of auditors in protests. And is this something that you are having to deal with in London, and is it requiring a new policing method?
Yeah, so yes, I mean we do the vast majority of protest policing, and so we get a lot of that. Clearly, I want to be careful that my answer doesn't imply something. I'll say something very clearly up front. If somebody wants to film something an officer's doing in the street, that's okay. We've got nothing to hide, but do it at a respectful distance. Don't try and telescope yourself into the situation and make it hard for the officer to deal with. That's the thing that is very difficult for officers. And auditors, so we've got protesters turning up and saying, I'm an auditor, as if it's some legal office, and therefore you can't deal with me as a protester. Well, you're still on this protest. Whether you've got a camera in your hand or not is irrelevant. And so that is another part of the challenge. And then they will put edited clips online to try and mispresent officers' action. So we've had to remodel our approach to social media and communications to try and get much more agile and dynamic to deal with that. Candidly, getting the facts very quickly in the middle of an operation is very difficult, but we've got much better at that and making more assertive, that's not true, we did this is why we did it, all those sorts of things, and putting out or putting out the whole video of an incident from officer's body worn rather than the clipped one. But it's a great challenge for officers to be wrestling with. I've just got my numbers here. Yes, it's going to be north of 500 by the time we get to the end of this financial year. We're at 416 as we came to this year, and we're heading towards probably being about 75,000 shifts by the end of the financial year, which is probably total cost of that 40 or 50 million, and that's 40 or 50 million of policing that's not policing communities, the point Margaret made earlier.
We've only got a few minutes left, and we do want to cover off just policing of football, because we've obviously been doing some work on that. So Paul Kohler.
What approach would the Met have taken to the issues that arose in the Maccabee-Aston Villa game?
So clearly, I'm not here to speak for West Midlands, but you get any key report on policing, and obviously the sort of Chief Inspector of Constabulary did a pretty forensic review on what he thought had gone right and wrong in that case. So we have looked at that and taken a judgment on, is there anything that we can learn from this in terms of our approaches? We're confident the flow of intelligence, sort of proper auditing of intelligence from picking of information, how it flows through and influencing decisions. We're broadly happy with our processes on that. The way our commanders make decisions, the audit trails on that, how we oversee operational risk as a senior team, up to and including myself and the deputy. We're happy with how we do that. We have a pretty well-established process for doing community impact assessments, but we've got some thoughts on some minor improvements to that. I think the critical issue, and I've discussed this with my command team, is about brutal operational clarity about policing purpose. If you are feeding information in on the basis of, is this sporting event safe to take place, your consideration has to be about the event and the spectators, not about wider issues. There's a safety of the event which I think stands on its own. There's a separate issue, of course, which is then the policing of that. If there are some people who object to the event taking place, then enabling it to do so might require some quite sizable policing. But separating those two things out, I think, is really important. There is something that my team have been working on, and one of my team leads nationally on some of the policing of major events. I think SAGs are overdue some reform. They don't really have a statutory basis. They're pretty variable across the country. I think some of them in some parts of the country end up being chaired by local politicians. I'm not sure that's a proper sort of operational meets policy separation. Some of this may be sortable by better guidance. I know that one of the national centres is working on that. But I do wonder whether they might need a legal basis at some point in the future.
How does the Met interact with SAGs?
So we, like other police force, in the sense of we're a part of SAGs, we're not generally chairing them, and we're feeding in our assessment based on the sort of intelligence about crime disorder. There'll be other considerations for a SAG, but we will feed in what we know and what our considerations are about crime disorder for that. I know that major concert, that sporting event, whatever else that would be. There is a difference I would make, picking up the point about protest. I think legally is important to separate out. On protest, we do take account of the community's view in a different way, because Parliament said we could put conditions on protest if it was going to have serious disruption to the life of the community. So you said to us, take account of the impact of protest on community. So in terms of us putting conditions on protest, we're not just looking at the protest itself, we're thinking about its impact on others. I think for a sporting event, if that is a lawful thing to happen, which, as long as it's safe, we should do everything we can do to enable that to do so.
Lastly, what is the Met saying to officers about the use of AI?
So we're using AI like every other organisation. We subscribe to the sort of national guidance on it in terms of ethical use of it. Clearly, the most critical thing in this is about the human in the loop and the quality assurance of what's going through and the processes you've got. So I sort of One simple example of high-end tech, our use of facial recognition, live facial recognition in the streets. Facial recognition doesn't decide somebody's going to get arrested. Facial recognition says, I've got a high degree of confidence that that person who's walking past the van is that person who's been wanted for 3 years for rape. The officer stops that person, checks out whether that looks right to them, checks out potentially with a fingerprint in the street, and then makes the arrest decision. And in the we do an annual report to put all the data out there. 1,000, just shy of 1,000 arrests over the year reported up to September last year. About a third of them for violence against women and girls offences, people wanted for those. 3 million people walked past the vans in that period of time. 0.0003% error rate. That's 10 people. It said, I think that one's wanted when it was a mismatch. 4 of those weren't even stopped because it was obvious to the officer that it wasn't right. 6 were spoken to briefly and on the way. If you compare that to human error, that's far, far, far lower. It's far less intrusive than police normal operations. And whilst there's clever technology saying, we think you should speak to this person. Sorry, Peter, I didn't mean to point at you that way. We think you should speak to this
I'm always getting a bit
We think we should speak to this person. The officer is making the decision. I think that's the critical point.
Thank you very much. There's still obviously many, many things we could ask you, but I am very aware that you do have to go. So thank you again for coming. We will not leave it so long for you to get you back.
Thank you.
Particularly keen to hear about all the work you've been doing and the initiatives and to see how they're developing. But once again,